Good morning, everyone. I have quite a pile of stuff up here because we're going to cover a lot of territory, and it's going to go more quickly than that sounded. It takes a long time to get from where we were last week with Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers to what Jim just read there, especially for Joseph to be able to say, I'm your brother Joseph, but don't be dismayed. Yeah, you were the ones that sent me into slavery, but it was God. How did Joseph get to that, to be able to say about the wrong that they had done to him, that no, this was about God sending me before you to preserve life? So I have a PowerPoint that's going to outline a few things that we're going to be talking about this morning. Let's see if we can get it to work. The title of this message is I Am Joseph, and I want to give you a little bit of a map of where we're going. Because first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about this way to kind of put a picture to our identity. Remember last week we did that with Joseph. Put Joseph in the middle, and we put all these characteristics around there. Today we're going to look at how Joseph changed from when he was 17 years old until he was probably about 38 or 9 or 40, somewhere in there. If you want to do something quite interesting, make one of these wheels for you at a certain point of your life some years ago. How about when you were 17 or when you were 27? And for those of you who have a lot more life, what would it look like to put when you were 27 next to when you were, let's say, in your 50s or 60s or 70s, to see the way in which your identity has changed? So this is what we're going to use once again. Before we get into that, I also want to get you ready for part of how I'd like to have you view this story. John Paul Lederach, who was developing peace agreements with the two groups in Nicaragua, was holding formal negotiations in Managua. This was back in the 80s. And he said that in nearly every meeting, somebody would read Psalms 85. And this morning, Jim just read Psalm 85, verses 9 and 10. But most times, it was read in Spanish. And none of the English translations really capture the way the Spanish Bible would read this. And I had to go back to one of the oldest English translations, which was done by the Catholic Church, translating from the Vulgate to the first English Bible, and it was called the Douay-Rheims Bible, that was done in France. It actually precedes the King James, and the King James actually borrowed from it some of its language. But that was what was read by Jim. Now, don't go to that Bible and try to look up Psalms 85, because it'll be in Psalms 84. I don't know how all this happens, but, in the translation process, we had to put chapters and verses to things. But it's a little bit of an interesting side study for me. But it's the Spanish language that John Paul noticed. We're given almost a persona, where the literal translation from Spanish to English goes, truth and mercy have met together. Justice and peace have kissed. You can kind of see that happening. 4 different concepts and 2 very powerful paradoxes. What John Paul also noticed is that when they come together, it's a place. It's like there is a meeting place where these persons of truth and mercy and justice and peace actually arrive together. And he calls that reconciliation. And that if we choose one of these over the other, it puts us in a false position. And I just think, wow, boy, think about that. With all of the different issues that we face as a congregation, as a family, as a country, as a world, I think each of us can find ourselves kind of drawn to one of these corners more than the rest of them. I want you to hold on to these concepts as we talk about this Joseph story today, to see where they show up, to see where they are present. Because it takes a little bit of practice to think about when truth is present and when truth isn't. When is mercy present and when isn't it? So I'm going to divide you up into groups. This is going to be you're going to participate in this with me. My water's over there. So we're going to do this like a ball field. So right field over here, I want you to be truth. So when you see truth show up in this story, what are you going to do? I want you to yell out, truth. And if one of you yells out but nobody else says anything, you can echo it like truth, truth, truth. Okay? So you're a truth, and here's what you are. You cast light so that all may see what really happened. You are concerned about transparency and honesty and clarity to set people free. You reside in each person, but no one owns you. Over here then, in right center field, we're going to have mercy. So again, when you see mercy show up, or when you can cry out for these when it's needed too, to say mercy, 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 you are a new beginning. You're concerned with how people in relationships are, whether they're healthy, whether they're staying healthy. You fear that justice will sometimes be too swift and that relationships might be damaged. In left center then, we're going to have this group here be justice. When you see justice show up, somebody can call out like your amen, justice, justice, yes, justice. You can add a phrase to it if you want. But where you see justice show up, or where you cry out for justice, that's when you would talk about that's how you show your concern with making things right. You want to find the root of inequality, whether it's the root of conflict, whether it's inequality or greed or wrongdoing, and you stand with truth to expose wrongdoing. You want to make sure that something's done to repair the damage. You are about love and accountability, so there's real change in behavior and action. And your fear is that mercy and peace will think that they're the parents of you. But they can only come after justice shows up. In left field, over here, you are going to be peace. Perhaps you'll be crying its absence more than crying its presence for a while. But when you see peace not being there, needing to show up, or where you see it, just shout out that you see peace, peace. You are what holds the community together. And there's ways in which truth and justice and mercy think that you show up after them. But that's not totally true. You also have to show up before them so the truth can actually be told. So justice can be carried out in a way that helps all of life to flourish, and then you go on and support that life. So this is your permission to participate, to echo each other, to grumble when you don't see it there, when you think it needs to be there. But it may help us be able to practice what it looks like to view these different things together. So let's see how this goes. I'm going to do just a little bit of a review from last week, from Genesis 37. If you remember Joseph's identity, he's Joseph. His language is Hebrew. His faith is of the Hebrew people. He's spoiled by his father. He's the firstborn son of Jacob's beloved Rachel, who died in his younger brother's birthing process. When Benjamin was born, Rachel died, and that only made Jacob even more fond of Joseph and Benjamin. He was in a blended family. Benjamin was his only true, full-blooded brother. He was favored. People in the community saw it, and it was shown with the extravagant gift of the ornate robe. And his brothers basically thought he was a tattletale, spoiled, lazy, unaware. So you remember where we left off. It was with this. They threw Joseph into a cistern, but Judah got the idea as some Ishmaelites were walking by in their caravan that, you know what, why don't we make a little money off of our brother? I mean, we can't stand him anymore. Let's get rid of him. Let's erase his identity from our family. And so they sell him upon Judah's idea and hang on to that. I really think Joseph probably overheard him saying it. Let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. So they sell him, and Joseph's identity has nothing to do with being a favored son anymore. His most prominent identity is that bigger circle of being a slave, that he is Hebrew, so he would be looked down on in Egypt, which makes it much easier to enslave someone then. And he's handsome and well-built. He's a young man. He's got some years left to give as a slave. So let's pick it up from here, where Joseph didn't give up his faith in God, but we have got 6,000 words to go from this picture to where Jim started reading today. It's almost 6,000 words. It's like 17 pages. That's a lot of ground to cover. Let's see if we can do it in maybe 5 minutes. We'll see how it goes. And don't forget your role, where you see truth or mercy or justice or peace, that you cry out for that. Joseph's identity is going to be changed drastically. The idea of himself being a dreamer, it's kind of gone within himself. It's not there anymore. But he does have a little bit of luck in this, or shall we say God's providence in it, in that he becomes a servant of Potiphar, who is an officer in Pharaoh's house. So that was good. And as Joseph began to work in Potiphar's house, everything that he did succeeded. He was just probably really good at working with people and managing things. And Potiphar began to trust Joseph with everything. Scripture says that he didn't concern him with anything about his household except what he ate. That was it. But then, and his Hebrew identity kind of started to fade a little bit. It wasn't as much of a thing to hold him down. Oh, I forgot this. He also was started in ESL classes. You know what those are. That's Egyptian as your second language. He was starting to adapt to the culture. And he is now, this trusted steward. Now, that was not very merciful the way I brought Potiphar's wife into the story. But Potiphar's wife comes in, and she begins to dominate the storyline. Perhaps Potiphar was busy. Perhaps he didn't pay lots of attention to his wife. And perhaps she spent much more time with Joseph than she did anyone else. And she liked him. And she was attracted to him. And she wanted him to sleep with her. And he refused. But I made this grow big, this part of Joseph's identity right now, because it says that day after day, Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph to sleep with her. Day after day, she was relentless with this. And so he started to avoid her at all costs. But one day, she caught him in the house when nobody else was there, and probably made the plead like she's never pleaded before. And she probably was grasping for Joseph. And Joseph is saying, how could I do this? Your husband has entrusted me with everything. All of this I can do with it, with whatever I want, except you. You're the only one that is really being withheld from me. He said, there's no way I could do this and bring this on Potiphar's house, and it would dishonor my God. And as Joseph tries to get away, she somehow ends up with his coat in his hand, perhaps ripped it off as he's leaving the house. And all of a sudden, Joseph's world gets turned upside down. And you'll notice that he goes from being Joseph and this honored servant of Potiphar to that Hebrew slave. His identity is starting to be wiped away. He's not going to be the servant in Potiphar's house anymore. There are no more ESL classes. He is sent into prison. Justice. He's sent into prison where Pharaoh sends the people that he's upset with from his household. And he's got a new identity. He's now a sex offender. That is a part of his life. It's a version of the truth. That's one of the questions for truth. If you stand for truth, how does one group say this and another group say this? How can that be? But again, Joseph becomes the trusted steward of the jail. The captain of the guard likes him. Again, Joseph's gifts come out. And this is what I meant about last week. He keeps showing up. In spite of how he keeps getting pushed down, he finds a way to show up again. He keeps using his gifts, even though now it's kind of buried. It is below the surface. It's really in prison. And that's what even here are people who find themselves in prison feel shut off from the world. What difference does it make what they're doing there, what good they're doing there? Nobody knows about it. That's where we need to remember we can find our own brothers and sisters that we haven't even met yet in those places. And then Joseph's identity, his thing of being a dreamer, starts to emerge again because Pharaoh's upset with his cupbearer and his baker, offended by them. He sends them into the prison, which again, this is the prison where Pharaoh uses that to place his people under arrest. And the cupbearer has a dream and doesn't know what the interpretation of it is. And Joseph says it's God that gives the interpretation of dreams and lets him know that you're going to be restored to your position. That's what your dream means. And it did come to pass. He was restored to his position again. And do you remember Joseph's plea with him where he said, "Would you please tell Pharaoh, I'm not a sex offender. I'm here in this place, in this dungeon, for no good reason. I didn't do anything. Would you please tell him that?" Yes, truth, and mercy. This was another gift of this, where Joseph was. He's 1 degree separated from the ruler of the entire empire. And his sex offender kind of tag seems to be shrinking just a little bit. And he's always remembering, he's always giving credit to God, that God is the one that is working here. As we go into this next part of the story, I'd like you just also to remember a quote from Richard Rohr that I really liked, is that nobody should be entrusted with power who has not known what it means to be powerless. You cannot trust someone with power unless they've known what it is to be powerless. And we're seeing Joseph's transformation. Had he gone right to where he's going to go in this next slide, from being that tattletale, kind of arrogant, unaware little brother, I'm not sure what kind of a ruler he would have been. But he learned what it was to be powerless, to not be the favored one, to be the one who's rejected. So he's no longer in prison. The 1 degree of separation isn't relevant anymore because Pharaoh wants to talk to Joseph. Because finally, after 2 years, the cupbearer said to Pharaoh, let me back up a minute. Pharaoh has a dream, 2 dreams on the same night, where he's standing by the Nile River, 6 fat, sleek cows. These are like grand champions at the fair coming out of the water, come out and graze, and then these sick, lean, probably infested with parasite cows come out and they eat the fat ones. And then he also has another dream that same night when he goes back to sleep, where there's a stalk that is growing that has these heads of grain on it that are full, and they're just showing signs of a bountiful harvest. And then these drought windblown, shrunken heads come and devour the full head of grain. So he doesn't know what this means. None of his magicians or the wise men can interpret the dream for him. And then the cupbearer, finally, after 2 years, remembers that, oh, wait a minute. Now, it may not have been 2 years. I might be getting that mixed up. But it was some time he finally says that, yes, I know of somebody who could interpret dreams in prison. And so Pharaoh calls for him. And Joseph finds himself to be in the presence of Pharaoh, who wants the interpretation of the dream. And Joseph tells him that God is the one who's given the interpretation. God is the one in 2 dreams is confirming what is actually going to happen. And is giving this as a gift to you, Pharaoh. What it means is there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. So use those 7 years of plenty to get ready for the famine that is going to come. And Pharaoh likes what he's hearing from him. It somehow resonates with him. And he said, well, what shall we do? And Joseph tells him, find somebody who's wise and discerning. Have them save 20% of the crops from every year in the 7 years so that you're ready for the drought years when they come. And Pharaoh says, who among us is any wiser than this Joseph who's standing in front of us? Let us make Joseph be that wise and discerning person. Let's put him in power. And now his Hebrew identity is almost disappearing. His Joseph name is going to be gone. He is now going to be called Zaphanath-Paneah. And there's supposed to be an H on there. That'll help you not forget it. It's Zaphanath-Paneah with an H on the end. I just didn't get back to correct that. And he is named as second in command. And he gets to be, he's really one of Pharaoh's favorite people. He's going to graduate from the ESL classes now. He's going to become fluent. He's getting this awesome signet ring. Pharaoh takes it off and gives it to Joseph. And this is the thing that will stamp all the orders. I mean, he can order anything to happen in all of Egypt and all of the empire. He's dressed like a prince. He's given fine clothes. And this part is really cool that I had kind of forgotten about, is that he gets an official chariot. It was the official chariot for the second in command. I mean, this is the big black SUV caravan that comes through town. The armored cars where everybody's saying, make way, make way. It's Zaphanath-Paneah on the move. And he became director of the empire, or governor. I'm not sure what title it would be. He's the vice president of agriculture, the Department of Homeland Services, Health and Human Services, kind of the Department of the Interior too, because he's going to have to devise ways, like these jars up here. Where are you going to put all this grain and store it? Can't imagine the infrastructure they would have had to figure out. And during this time, Joseph has 2 children, and it's significant, and he names them Manasseh, the God has helped me forget my troubles, and Ephraim, which means I have been fruitful in this land. So here was Joseph at 17. And there is Joseph at 30. Do you notice how his identity as being Joseph and as being a Hebrew is kind of hidden by, at least the way I've done it, with his identity as a prince, as that second in command. That gets us all the way to where Joseph's brothers show up. 7 years of plenty happened. 2 years of famine had occurred. Jacob and his sons were running out of food. They go to the refrigerator, they can see the back. Our kids would always tell us, hey, Mom or Dad, you can see the back of the fridge again. That's kind of what it was like. There was nothing. This famine was covering the entire world around them. So Jacob gets them to go to Joseph to seek food. They didn't know it was going to be him. And when they come to Joseph, it says that they bow down before him. Remember Joseph's dream about the sheaves? We were gathering sheaves. And my sheep stood up, and all of yours bowed down to me. And it just made the brothers hate him. And here they are, bowing down to him. And it says that Joseph remembered that. And was it that the gift, I think it was partly the gift of the dream that he had that allowed him to think, God, what are you doing through all of this? This is bigger than just me, because now I see it happening. And they don't know that I am their brother, but I know who they are. And Joseph goes through a whole series of ways to test them. And I don't know if any of that was vindictive or not. I mean, he acts angry with them. He acts harsh with them. He locks them in jail for 3 days, claims that they're spies, even though they say they're not. And he wants to know, well, do you have any other brothers? And they said, yeah, there is one, and there's one that's no more, which is Joseph, of course, and Benjamin is the one that's still back with Dad. After 3 days, he said, okay, I'm going to let you go back with your grain, but you need to bring Benjamin back with you, your younger brother. Then I will know that you're not spies. And do you catch this, that this is worthy of the death penalty if they're found to be spies? You know how unnerving this would be with the brothers? How dismayed they would be? And they go back and tell Jacob that we have to bring Benjamin back with us. And Jacob is again almost beyond grief. I lost one son, and now if you take Benjamin, we may never get him back. So they don't go until the food runs out. And then Judah comes to Jacob and says, look, Dad, we have to go back. We have waited so long, we could have been there and back twice. And Judah says, I'll bear the blame for this if anything happens to Benjamin. And Jacob finally relents, in part because there is nothing to eat. If they don't do something, they're going to starve. So they go back with Benjamin. So now it's all the brothers with Joseph. And when he sees Benjamin, he's overcome. He has to leave, and he goes and weeps in another room. Then he washes himself all up again so they can't tell that he's been crying, and then comes back. And then he offers them the chance to dine together, and the Hebrews and the Egyptians could not eat together, so the brothers were served separately. Benjamin is with them, and he gets 5 times the portions of all the other brothers. Now imagine that fear that they had about whether he was going to be believed of whether they were spies or not. Would he believe that they're honest? And then they're sitting there trying to enjoy this meal, still wondering what's going to happen to them. And they look down and see Benjamin just keep getting the mashed potatoes and the roast beef and whatever all it is. And it's like, I mean, it's like, I don't get this. You know, they're probably looking at each other like, I don't know what's going on, but this is, I don't know, is this good? I think it's good. Then they leave. And Joseph has his soldiers, his guards, his people, whoever they are, he wanted them to fill their sacks with grain as much as they could carry, sends them back home, but they have hidden his silver chalice, the silver chalice of the governor of the empire, in Benjamin's sack. And after they leave, the brothers don't know this has happened, they're overtaken by Joseph's soldiers. And they charge them with stealing the governor's silver chalice. And they just said, oh, no, we're not. We're honest men. We never did this. And they start going, if I remember right, from oldest to youngest. Benjamin is the last one. When they open up his bag, they pull out the silver chalice. And the brothers just fall apart. How could this get any worse? And then they had to return. Think about what that would be like. Scared to death that Benjamin is going to either be imprisoned or killed, that their whole family's falling apart, and they have this long, silent journey back to Zaphenath Paneah's court. And here they are, finally standing before him. And Zaphenath-Paneah charging them with this crime. Like, why would you do this? Don't you know this cup is the source of my, it says, divination. It helps me with my governing. And how could you take this? And he could have ordered him to be imprisoned or killed. And here's what I think is so fascinating about this story is Judah. Judah shows up. Finally. And he stands before Joseph and he says, we have one brother who isn't living anymore, and the death of that brother has nearly brought my father to the grave in sorrow. He's never gotten over it. If we are to lose Benjamin, if he is to lose Benjamin, it is going to kill my father. So will you please take me? Take me instead. It's such a powerful story. This is still Zaphenath-Paneah. He orders everybody out of the room because I think I see in him is that justice is finally coming out. Somebody is recognizing the truth of what happened. And they're taking responsibility for it to make it as right as they can. And it changes something inside of Joseph. Now, this is kind of an ironic and funny part of this story to me. You know, the ESL classes, Joseph is fluent in Egyptian. He speaks through an interpreter the entire time with his brothers. They have no idea that he understands what they're saying, ever. Until he sends everyone out of the room, and he can't control himself anymore, and he breaks into this deep guttural cry that I have only heard twice in my life from another individual, and it was when I worked for the STAR program, and it's linked often to deep, deep trauma. There is a guttural, it's almost a primitive cry that humans are capable of that empties out the darkest and the worst things that have happened to us. And the brothers must be wondering, why is this guy falling apart? None of this makes sense. And when he's finally done wailing and he turns to them and he says, I am Joseph. It's like, wow. They were beyond stunned. All of a sudden, they've got to put these two different identities together. The 17-year-old that they remember that they sold into slavery, and now here's a person that, by his word and his signet ring, can order their deaths at any moment. How is this possible? And Joseph brings it immediately to saying, he calms them, don't be dismayed. It wasn't you, but God sent me. That is the thing that I think we long for in our stories, is when is the but God going to be in our story? This was meant for harm, whatever it was, or we made poor choices, or other people made awful choices toward us. But God sent me ahead of you so that I could preserve your life and the empire and the surrounding countries. If my math is somewhat close, it's been 20 years. They've been cut off from each other longer than they lived together. What about us? Who are we? We've had messages about what Jesus says about us. What do we say about ourselves? How would you finish the sentence like Joseph? What would you say? That I am this. I can finally say this. It's a part of me that's been hidden. It's been cut off because these have not been in my life. They've been absent. What would need to happen to be able to enter that middle place where God resides, the place of reconciliation, a place where relationships are renewed, a place where we can reclaim our hidden identities, and we hide them so we can protect them from further harm? You know, Joseph's story has an incredible ending. It's an archetype of the story of Christ coming then in the New Testament. But what if the ending isn't happy? What if truth doesn't show up? What if mercy is never extended? And what if justice is incomplete or it's skewed? What if peace is never fully realized? This is where I think we look to Jesus. I don't know of any place where truth and mercy and justice and peace come together more clearly than at the cross, and then experienced in the resurrection. That, I think, is where we find it. The Anabaptist Vision and Discipleship series was about living the Beatitudes as a way to claim our identity as followers of Jesus. Because Jesus knew there's going to be those who mourn that aren't going to find very much comfort. There's going to be the meek and the poor who don't have land. There's going to be peacemakers that experience the harsh violence, both physical and sexual violence. There's going to be those who hunger and thirst after justice, but they're not going to find it. Jesus says, I know the truth you want others to know. I know the pain of staying silent because it isn't safe. I know what you keep hidden, and one day it will be made right. That is our firm hope in Christ's resurrection. It can ground us and keep us until the day when truth and mercy and justice and peace are all fully present. Then we can reclaim our true identity in the way that Joseph did, when he could finally say to himself and to his brothers, I am Joseph.